Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith and you're watching another episode of Overbooked here on the channel. This is the series where I talk about every single book on my shelves because we will uncover the mysteries of the fairy world. Today we are talking about Heather Fawcett's Emily Wilde series. We're going to be talking about Book 1, Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, and Book 2, Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands. Some quick disclaimers before we start. I had review copies of both of the books that are out in this series so far. Could not tell you where my copy of Book 2 has gone. It's somewhere in the house, but regardless of where books come from, nobody's paying me to talk about books except my patrons, and all opinions are my own. I'm going to keep this as spoiler-free as humanly possible while still talking about both books. If you do want to go in knowing absolutely nothing, pause the video, come back when you've read it, we'll talk then. And I will link the story graph for the series down below in case you want to check out any user-generated content warnings. I didn't realise until I was doing the research for this video, but I have actually read a book by Heather Fawcett before. She's a Canadian author, and she has also written a fair few things, but the thing that I have read is called Even the Darkest Stars, which was a fairy loot book from many, many years ago. We're talking maybe 2017, 2018, and it involved a chase to the top of a mountain. And I remember liking it, but not enough to read the sequel. The Emily Wilde series, however, is a adult fantasy, romance, light academia kind of story. We're still in the middle of the series. The first book came out in January of 2023, and book 2 came out in the January of 2024, very recently at the point when this video goes up. In these books, we follow Emily Wilde, who is an academic. She is a professor. She studies fairies, and she is a woman in her field, which is still kind of a slightly frowned upon thing in this world, but she is forging pathways for herself, and in book 1 we meet her going on an expedition to the frozen north in order to complete her encyclopedia of fairies that she is working on. However, who should show up but her academic rival Wendell Bandlebury? She's not super excited at working with him, but there's also other things going on to do with the fairies they encounter on this expedition. Book 2 is another adventure following the same characters, though slightly less academically motivated as a venture, but it is nonetheless an exciting journey that they go on, and in the books we read about these adventures through Emily's diary entries that she is taking at that point in the story. If you already know that you enjoy fantasy romance and light academia, here is a series for you. You should probably pick this up if you haven't already. I haven't read a lot of light academia books. That's not a particular sub-genre that I've encountered a lot of. I did like these. I think I personally have much more an interest in the critiquing of academia that comes with dark academia. We could talk about that for a long while. However, if you want just that kind of study experience, this is a series that does include that. I liked a lot of the academic aspects of the story. I liked this, not scientific in modern scientific sense, but sort of an old-timey scientific exploration that we do, and I thought that the way those themes built and played out in book 2 were very interesting as well. We tackled light academia. In terms of fantasy romance, it's a good fantasy world. I like a world with fairies in it. I don't read a lot of them. I think the market is a little bit saturated, but this was an interesting angle to approach that from this more studying, studious way. And as a romance novel, I also thought it was enjoyable. I have thoughts on that. We'll come on to it as we go through the video. I thought the world building was well handled. I think starting it off with the sense that Emily is constructing this encyclopedia is very helpful for that, because she can include thoughts on all other species of fairies and give you points of reference for how fairies are operating and how different worlds are touching one another in this particular way of dealing with it, because obviously everyone and their mum has read a different book about fairies that tackle them in very different ways. I liked getting to meet the characters and creatures that we met in book 1. I think that possibly my favourite character of all is her dog, who is a sort of unearthly dog called Shadow. I love him, but I'm always going to be a sucker for the dog. Overall, I liked this approach to tackling how are we going to portray a world that has interaction with fairy. A lot of it comes into folklore and superstition. There's very much that sense of some things are actually legend, some things are real, some things stride the line between them. It's a really interesting way of approaching it. It has that very obvious comparison to the memoirs of Lady Trent, Natural History of Dragons, if you've read those. Those are different for reasons we'll come on to, but I think that same sense of still very much being in a period of discovery about this particular subject, that comes through in both books. I like a pragmatic protagonist, especially in a romance novel. I talked about that fairly recently when I was reviewing The Witch Would Not by Olivia Atwater. Slightly neurodivergently coded, shall we say, main character who just is a little bit no-nonsense and isn't pandering to anyone. I think that's one of the strongest things about Emily, is she is advocating for herself, and even when she gets to care for other characters and she cares deeply about how she is perceived, it doesn't affect her ultimate goal, and I liked that about her. I think she could have very easily come across either as very cookie cutter, strong female character, or very wet blanket sort of thing, and she manages to avoid both of those pitfalls. I thought book 2 managed to develop her character in a way that I found really interesting, and I think it's because it adds in more context to her academic background, and it brings in other characters who you kind of see her interact with, which you don't get in book 1, so it builds her out much more as a character. If you're finding her a little bit lackluster in book 1, book 2 she gains a lot more body. I should also probably mention the love interest, but I have a complicated feeling about the love interest. I'm just going to check it's not it's in the blurb. They do call him her dashing and insufferably handsome academic rival, so I think I'm okay saying he's the love interest. Her academic rival, Wendell, is also a love interest in the story, and when I first read book 1, I was not on board. I got very frustrated by the idea of wanting to date your academic rival because I care deeply about women getting credit for their work. On a reread, I liked him a lot more. In book 2, I liked him a lot more. I think knowing how things end up is a lot easier than meeting him right at the start of the book, and a lot of your opinions of him are coloured by Emily's opinions of him, which are not high at the start of book 1. So I ended up going, why have you done a 180 on this guy? I haven't yet. I still think he kind of sucks. But by the time I did a reread, by the time I read book 2, I was on board. I will say, Wendell, not a super romantic name. I personally substituted that name in my mind. I do apologise if your name is Wendell, but I don't know what to say. It didn't work for me. I changed it to something better. I think because of that romance angle and the fact that it's much better when you know where he gets to as a character, I do think book 2 is the stronger of the two books. I found the adventure better. I found the addition of side characters really helpful. I think you have to read book 1 first to get some context, but book 2 is a much stronger book overall, and it makes book 1 feel better in comparison, which is something I've been finding a lot with books lately. When I reviewed Notorious Sorcerer recently, I felt very similarly. I think a lot of debut books have a very limited cast of characters, and actually expanding them out in a sequel is a really smart idea. The last thing I'll say is that I don't think the format always works in its favour. So I mentioned that comparison to Lady Trent, and the thing with the Lady Trent books is that they are written as memoirs. So while they are a record of events from one character's perspective, they are not directly in the moment works of writing. However, in this we are dealing with Emily's diary entries that are exploring usually the day before or the end of a day that she has just experienced. And I think it makes things feel very strangely paced, because often we will either be getting, right now at this very moment I'm upset about this thing, or it has been 3 days since I wrote in this diary, let me tell you all the feelings I've been feeling. It didn't make the reading experience more enjoyable for me. I found it quite difficult to get through, especially in book 1. Book 2 I was more used to it, but book 1 it felt very staggered as a plot, where I think had it been more of a reflective look at the events rather than in the moment, it would have felt a better paced novel. If you don't get on with books that are diary entries, obviously this isn't going to work. I'm reading Letters to the Luminous Deep, which is a epistolary novel, which I'm going to see if that makes a difference, or if it's just for me that these sort of slightly unique formats don't work. We'll find out together. Comparisons, other things you might want to read. I've already mentioned a couple of these. If you haven't read the memoirs of Lady Trent, what are you doing? Go out there, get yourself some copies, give yourself a wonderful time. I do have a review video up for at least one of them, I think. That video is probably very old. Please excuse the quality. I also already mentioned Olivia Atwater's work. That is the Regency Fairy Tales series and the Victorian Fairy Tales series, both of which are fantastic. If you like fantasy romance, they are well worth reading. It's not light academia by any stretch of the imagination, but they are very good fun. And the last thing I thought I would mention is Greta Helsing, which is a series that is set in the modern day, which you wouldn't think I would be recommending. But there's something about Greta Helsing being a doctor to the undead that appealed to very similar themes, I think, in this book about helping people and trying to better understand people and folklore and suspicion and all those things. I thought there was a connection, and also I like to recommend Greta Helsing, so you should read those. Should you read the Emily Wilde series? I think they are worth reading if you are here for a light academia fantasy romance that is written as diary entries. If any aspect of that is not for you, I don't think they would work, but if you're happy with all of those things, in principle, I think they're a good time. Book 2 was really solid. I think the next book will probably cement it. Either it's going to be a great series that I will definitely reread and recommend, or it'll be something that I go, that was a fun time to move on, as happens. But with book 1 and 2 together, I am satisfied that this is a good series and I will be recommending it when the right context comes around. Have you read these? Do you have plans to? Let me know down in the comments below. While you're commenting, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It makes me feel loved and appreciated. You can also come hang out on Discord where we have chill chats about books. I'd like to say an enormous thank you to all the ghosts who haunt me over on Patreon. They support the channel and in return get early access to videos, bonus content, my weekly live streams, and more. If you want to join their number, that's linked below as well. Thank you so much to you for watching. That's all from me, and I will see you in the next one.
There's gonna be some bloopers now.
We shall be talking about book 1, Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. I don't know why I said encyclopedia so weird, but it happened.